Thank you, President Frank, and thank all of you. This is an illustrious crowd. I thank Mark Lotman and Lisa Kutila for bringing me here. This is an amazing community, and it's a magical place. This is especially a magical and important place for me because this area is where I proposed to my wife. I proposed to her up at Bandelier, up in what I guess used to be called the ceremonial kiva, but I understand that's redundant because kivas are ceremonial, so it's just the cave now. And so when I proposed to her, the story I like to tell, and I apologize for those of you I've already sort of said this to, but I was proposing to her and I was facing her, you know, and her back was towards the cave and my back was towards the rest of the world. And as I was proposing to her, apparently, I don't remember this, but she says, I was starting to slip down the cave, like down the side of the cliff. And so she hurriedly said, yes, yes, and she sort of grabbed me and sort of moved me away so I wouldn't fall off the cliff. And so I like to say that I was able to marry my wife because I threatened to fall off the cliff if she wouldn't say yes. And the coda to that is I talked to her last night and said I was sharing the story, and thankfully she didn't take back her decision. Which was quite a number of years ago. So this is an important place for me personally. When you're proposing to your wife, you're really envisioning the future, and you're thinking about what the future can bring. And what's interesting about human beings is we are the only species on Earth that has this capacity to envision the future in this way. We look at the future and we think, I like that state. That's a better place than I'm right now. Let me figure out how to get there. And you think about what it takes to build great companies. I mean, the ability to say, you think of what most animals do. They'll think, well, I just want to move, I just want to get that banana, or I just want to eat this, or I just want to use the most sophisticated they get is they say, I'll pick up this tool and I want to break this, and then I can eat it. Humans can say, I want to construct a company with thousands of employees serving products to millions of people all over the world. And you think about how remarkable that is, our faculties in actually trying to do that. And so if you take that to the meta level, which is I want to build an economy that actually provides better jobs and better products and services for the world and makes wealth for everybody, how complicated a process that is. But what we need is we need tools to do that, right? When we envision the future, it's easy to sort of think about that in the abstract, but then we try to figure out what are the little steps to get there. And so what we've tried to do in the last over a decade, these ideas are ideas that have been fostered in my mind and my colleagues' minds for a number of years, is to figure out, well, how do we get there, right? We all know we want to get there. We know we want to get through this door, because on the other side of the door is a rainforest, is this community where we get lots of economic growth, we get lots of activity. And how do we do that? So I use this image a lot, which is this portal, this doorway, to kind of walk through the other side. So what I want to do is, within this brief time we have together, give you a little bit of an idea about how to get through that doorway. So let's try to step through that door. So I'm going to start by introducing you to a couple of folks. These are the Gouches, John and Susan Gouch. So those of you who read the book, you haven't seen their pictures probably, so here they are. So 1994, Susan and John Gouch were at the University of Kansas, and they were doing research in the field of metasearch on what was emerging. The internet was emerging to become a tool that people could actually start to use. And they've been doing a lot of prominent research in this field. So at the University of Kansas, they applied and got a little grant for $15,000. They called it Jayhawk Search. And metasearch, for those of you who don't know it, is the ability to do, it's a search engine of search engines. So in theory, metasearch allows you to get better searches on the web. By 1995, they had huge results. They weren't expecting this at all. They had 300,000 users per month. They had moved to a dedicated server, and they launched a company out of it. In fact, the funny thing is when you talk to Susan about this, she'll say, we didn't start a company originally because we didn't see how anybody could make money giving away search for free. Right? She didn't think that could possibly be a viable business. But that's what it became. So they launched a company out of it. By 1996, they had 1 million users a month. This thing was really taking off. And they had what was arguably a phenomenal piece of search technology for the world. And the world was looking for this stuff. In fact, they were better in performance than anything else that was out there on the market. By 1997, PC Magazine. Now, for those of you who remember what magazines are, PC Magazine is a publication that was quite prominent in its time. And PC Magazine was named Profusion the Meta Search Engine of the Year. That is, it was the best search engine of search engines in the entire world in 1997, right? And so that adage that if you build a better mousetrap, the world will beat a path to your door, seemed like it ought to make sense. They had the world's best mousetrap in 1997. In 1998, they kept trying to grow. They were trying to build managers. They tried to put together some business partnerships. They were really trying to expand because they saw this as the big thing. And what happened after 1999 and later was the company failed. It floundered. There were a whole bunch of decisions that were made that didn't work out well for the company. And so they ended up with very little. The aftermath, they made about $100,000 for this company. They went through a series of acquisitions and they ended up with very little. If you do the math, they were pretty much worked for less than minimum wage by the time it was all done, right? It was not a very successful endeavor. So the question is why? I call this the anti-Google because it's very funny. In the early years, like around 96 or so, 97, Google actually called the Gouches and said, hey, you guys are so prominent in search. Can you guys link to us and drive traffic over to Google? Because we're starting out here and we'd like to get some attention. And so this was the anti-Google, right? Everything that happened right with Google didn't happen with a company like Profusion and the Gouches. And this is a story that's useful for places like New Mexico because you have some of the world's best mousetraps here. And the challenge is, well, why don't the mousetraps really take off? And so the question is, it has to be it's not the mousetrap's problem, right? It's got to be something else that's the problem. And so that's what has led this thought process to think about how to conceive of economic development and economic growth in an entirely different way. So how should leaders approach economic development today? You know, we talk about steps and levers, and you know, when we think of economic growth, today we have a set of tools and levers we use to drive economies, right? You think of, in Washington, central banking, right? Those are tools and levers you use to try to affect the quality of life. There's tools that folks like Mark Lotman use when they're designing economic projects to think about what are the benefits in terms of job creation and wealth in the community. So we have tools for that. But what do you do when you're looking at situations like this? What are the tools you use to define these new innovative economies that everybody's trying to build? Well, to do that, we have to step back, right? We need to provide some context. And so what I'm going to do very briefly is give you a little tour of economic history. Not too boring, but just enough to make it interesting and informative. So in 1776, a guy named Adam Smith wrote a book. And this was the birth of what we call classical economics. He basically said, well, economic value comes out of the mixture of some basic factors of production. Back then it was land, labor, and capital. Those were the only factors that people thought about. And everything that we think of as economics is derived from the combination of those things and creating output. That is, you could set all prices, you could define all value through this basic mixture of inputs and outputs. If you go to 1871, this was a year that a few folks started to think about, well, maybe there's more to it. Maybe the England of the late 1700s, this kind of solid, contained, isolated state system wasn't all that there was. Maybe this stuff is in flux. Maybe there's dynamism. And so this idea that supply and demand pushed and pulled back and forth, and that you could actually measure tension between buyers and sellers and suppliers started to take hold. And it wasn't until a few decades later that people realized this was actually a new era. They called this a neoclassical economics era. They called it several decades later. Thorstein Veblen labeled it as such. But back then, it was just the sense that the old theories weren't good enough. And so neoclassical economics was born, which is land, labor, and capital constantly in flux because people are you're trying to match up buyers and sellers. And so we think of marketplaces today, right? You can see this, right? We all learn about these curves for supply and demand in high school. If you move a little bit closer to recent times, you get 1990, which was the development of what we call cluster theory. And this was Michael Porter at Harvard Business School coined this term, but he wasn't the only one. There were folks like Paul Krugman who actually talked a lot about the geographical basis of economic growth. This is a diagram of the auto industry cluster around Detroit. And you can see geography mattered, right? You could actually see the effects of economic activity because people tended to cluster geographically. And so this has become, in many ways, the dominant framework for economic development in the innovation space. People like to say, well, you just shove them close together. And that's what drives economic activity, because that's what we've seen in other places. It's not just Detroit. It's every sort of major geographical center has had this kind of network effects. But this doesn't really reflect the world we see. Now, Silicon Valley was birthed out of this cluster model, right? This is an aerial view of the area that we typically think of as Silicon Valley, and you can see all these pieces within a little short distance from one another. You have your Capitol at on Sand Hill Road and the intersection of 280. You have the law firms at Page Mill and El Camino. You got all the technology coming out of Stanford. People have said for decades in the Valley, well, you only do deals where you can get to within a 30-minute drive of all the pieces of the deal, right? You wouldn't want to do that more because it's high touch. It's a very close-knit kind of environment. But this cluster model is breaking down. This is a company that I've been working with. And you see all these components, all these various pieces everywhere. And it's true the company does have a main place of business, but if you look at where the value in the business is coming from, you look at all the stakeholders involved in this business, you look at where the money's coming from, where the expertise came from, where the science came from, you look at where the talent immigrated from, it's all over the world. So this is very interesting, right? Because it seems like the world we're experiencing is not quite exactly the same as the cluster models of old. And so all these models they seem unsatisfactory. They don't seem to work. So how do we cultivate systems instead of just describe them? Because what we've seen with all these theories is they're great ways of descriptions, but they're not prescriptions. They don't tell us really what to do. So we need a new framework. And if you look at the movement from 1776 to 1871 to 1990 to 2012, we're sort of here today kind of struggling with what do we do after this major Great Recession. How do we bounce back from that and develop the next wave of economic growth? Now the model we have today is pretty familiar to us, right? It's the assembly line model. And this is a picture from the dawn of the industrial era. You have people working in assembly lines. Everyone's got their specific job. You're trying to move stuff along, and everybody adds their pieces, their factors of production into that assembly line process. Control, precision, calculation, timing, everything gets calibrated to the tightest piece possible. And this is the same today, right? This is a picture of Foxconn. They make stuff, electronic stuff, most famously stuff for Apple. And it's the same way, right? You know exactly the second an employee clocks in, you know the second they clock out. You may even build a business model with the times that they go to the bathroom. You know exactly what they're doing. You know how many pieces they're installing every second, every minute. It's all finely calibrated. And we don't just do this for tangible objects, we do this for intangible objects as well, right? You think of computer programming centers, you think of most office centers, you think of call centers. It's the equivalent of knowledge-based production in an assembly line process. You're still calculating lines of code, you're calculating hours and minutes of labor. But what we're looking for is something different. And if you think of assembly line processes as a farm or a plantation, you get some insight into the difference, which is on farms, you want to control, right? You want to control the amount of output over a piece of land. And you do that by calibrating the seeds, the irrigation, predicting the temperature. You even buy futures to try to offset volatility because you're trying to reduce risk, right? The idea is reduction of risk and uncertainty, maximization of control. And that's how you yield more production on a farm. But if you think of places like Silicon Valley, and what Silicon Valley offers is not necessarily a place, but a different way of adapting economically. It provides a place that's more like a rainforest, which is a highly unpredictable environment where you don't know what the crops are. If an assembly line is a process by which you know what the output is, places like Silicon Valley are rainforests where you don't know where the output is. And if you have a weed on a farm, what do you do to the weed? You pull it, you kill it, you try to use Monsanto Roundup to prevent it even from springing up in the first place. In a rainforest, the weed is often the most valuable thing. A company like Facebook 6-7 years ago was nothing but a weed. Companies like Google 15 years ago were nothing but weeds. They just weren't things that you could have predicted. You can't predict the outcome. And so the value in these systems, these economic systems, is very different than what we think of intuitively as economic value, because we can't control what's coming out of these systems, right? They're highly experimental systems. So if you're a leader that's looking at the whole system, your intuition might be, well, we just need to do more companies by sticking more factors of production in. But if you're looking at it abstractly, you think, well, actually, you can't predict what you're supposed to invest in. In fact, when government does it, it tends to do it very poorly. And so we have this great paradox, which is while crops are harvested most efficiently on farms, weeds sprout best in rainforests. And you can see this paradox, just in an iPhone, like I was mentioning before. Foxconn makes these iPhones with a tremendous amount of precision, right? You don't want a creative person in the Foxconn assembly line, right? You don't want them to say, you know what, this phone, I'll just add my personal touch to it. You don't want that, right? But if you think of the software that goes into Apple, right? I'm sure the Apple team right now, probably today, is sitting around trying to figure out, all right, iPhone 6, next generation operating system, next design of the phone. They're not in the business of manufacturing it. They're thinking of how do we conceptualize this. They have no idea right now what it's going to look like, right? So they have to change the way they behave within this company. So they have to do both. They have to walk and chew gum at the same time. They have to think, well, how do we create highly serendipitous thinking processes that actually cause what's unpredictable to then turn into something that's very predictable later. What we find is these types of innovations emerge in these types of ecosystems, which is the interaction of all these various pieces together. It's not just the raw basic inputs, money and talent, which we know. It's their interaction with coaches and mentors, with academic institutions, with business resources, with news and media, with real estate, with trade industry organizations, with the world of ideas that's circulating freely now on the internet. It's this interaction that causes this interesting stuff to emerge that we can't otherwise predict. But this requires a big shift in perspective in how we think of managing economic growth, right? This is the traditional system, and this is actually in Russia today and in China, the central government still plans their economies using these types of diagrams. Basic inputs, land, labor, capital, and some would argue technology, basically shoved in. And you think of this, we talk about training kids in technology and engineering and science, same thing, right? We think of capital, we think of funding mechanisms, we think of land, how do we build more stuff, right? Traditional model. But the real world is different. The real world is nuanced because we have human beings in there, and they're not gears, they're not anonymous cogs. And so the land has a landlord who decides what to do with that land. The labor may have an engineer that decides how to allocate his or her time. The capital is managed by an investor. And the technology often has a scientist. Maybe they're in charge of the rights to license this technology or to build a company out of it. So there's human beings. There's something about what those human beings do that causes that output, right? So we're inserting something into this traditional model to say, well, what about the human beings? And I noticed President Frank had studied psychology. So what's the psychology, right? Psychology in many ways is a big missing piece here because what ticks up here affects how we interact within these communities, these ecosystems. And real human beings are separated, right? We're separated by geography, by culture, by lack of trust, by language, by social networks. And if you've ever been in the experience of trying to commercialize something out of a research institution, I know many of you have, you can put a brilliant scientist who's developed the perfect cure for cancer right next to the perfect business person who's commercialized great drugs before for that specific cure. And what are you going to get? Well, the traditional economic model says, well, you're pretty much done. You just put them together. In real life, they usually hate each other, right? 90% chance, 99% chance they don't understand each other. They don't quite know what to do with each other. They can't figure out how to structure the deal. It's not even clear if they even want to do a deal together, right? So these barriers are very steep, right? They're very tall because these invisible walls we put up around each other are actually what inhibit a lot of opportunity. And this isn't just a couple people sitting in a conference room or a coffee shop. This happens across entire systems, which is most of the stuff, all the knowledge, all the resources each of you controls individually, they're stuck, right? They're locked inside you until you reach out across these barriers to find someone to transact with, to do business with, to share with. Now, there's a woman who passed away a few months ago named Elinor Ostrom. Some of you might have seen this in the news. She won a Nobel Prize in Economics in 2009. She was the first woman to win a Nobel Prize in Economics ever. And she was the first non-economist to win this Nobel Prize. And when she won the Nobel Prize, most economists had to go look her up to figure out who she was. She was a political scientist, and what she realized is, well, the model doesn't make sense that economists use. If you actually go and look at communities, if you look at situations where people are sharing limited resources, whether it's a forest or a lake or an irrigation stream, she finds that they don't engage in zero-sum games. They're not always at war with each other. What she found is the more they communicate, the more they chat, the more they have collaboration with one another, they can turn those zero-sum games into positive-sum games. They can actually maximize the output of finite resources. And in many ways, what Ostrom got onto, and she spent decades trying to studying this stuff in the field, talking to real people, is the dynamic at work in Silicon Valley, which is the micro, the way that people behave at the micro level causes macro effects. And so the secret of innovation ecosystems has to be this, which is ultimately the value comes from how culture, how people behave, overcomes these social barriers between ourselves and fosters collectivity, trust, collaboration among highly diverse people. So how do we design networks then where the value comes from chaos? How do we in fact create assembly lines where we don't know what the outcome is going to be? This is like a fractal equation in nature, right? In nature, in fractals, a little tiny micro equation can create things like ferns. And if you take these micro equations and replicate them even more, they create entire systems, right? You can see cultural patterns from entire mountain ranges and coastlines derived from fractal patterns. And what we see in human beings, because human beings are biological creatures too, we're natural phenomena too, we follow many of the similar patterns, which is the little shifts in the ways that we interact are just like the way atoms interact with each other in physical systems. It changes the whole nature of the system itself. Can we take all these ideas? What you find is, it's very interesting now, and the book kind of surveys large areas of biology and psychology and design thinking, et cetera. Everybody's been talking about the same thing, but they're all coming at it from different angles. And they're describing these phenomena. And you know, I'll give you just some, I won't go too much into these folks, there's a lot of people here, and these are all cited some way or other in the book. But the idea that you can actually watch the brain, imaging, right? You can actually see how people react when they're encountering groups of people that are different from one another, and you can see defense reactions. And you realize that the more diverse people are, the more different they are, the more they stand off from one another, right? So exactly the kind of behavior you want in innovative systems is actually what the brain is triggered to defend itself against, because we're actually wired not to trust and collaborate with people that are the most different from ourselves. But if you think of where innovation really comes from, the nature of these ecosystems, it's exactly that. It's getting people who are really different, in fact, people who are oddly different from one another, to find ways to interact and lower these social barriers. So whereas most folks talk about creative destruction in these types of economies, and you still hear this, people say creative destruction. You got to be able to destroy stuff fast, right? You know, I used to practice law, and putting a company through bankruptcy was not nearly as hard as building it. He could put a company through bankruptcy in a few weeks or a few months for a really big company. But for building that same company, it's much harder to put the Legos together than it is to break the Legos apart. So we call it creative reassembly, which is the process of assembling the pieces and having communities that allow you to assemble faster. And for those of you who've been entrepreneurs, you know it's the speed of assembly, right? It's to say, look, if I'm going to hire someone, it takes me 3 months to find someone versus 2 weeks to find someone. That's not just a little bit helpful. That's life and death for the company, right? Or if my lawyer charges me a retainer fee of $10,000 to patent something versus someone that'll sort of share in the risk and let me pay them after I raise my first round of financing, that's life or death for the company. So the assembly process, all the little things that get in the way of assembling the pieces of a company, the Lego blocks of a company, are absolutely critical. These cultural patterns came in Silicon Valley, and arguably what makes America so fascinating is because of the frontier experience. Now, Frederick Jackson Turner is a historian who about 120 years ago put forward this frontier thesis, which was what made America so special was this line of the frontier. And this line was moving from east to west, and it divided what was civilization to what was not civilization. And on the frontier, you see a very different set of behaviors compared to where you have traditional civilized states, which is on the frontier, people learn to get along with one another who are highly diverse because they have to. They have no choice. They have no family to rely on. And you see this behavior here in New Mexico. I've seen it, right? This is a place that's very comfortable welcoming a wide variety of ideas. You don't see this as much, even as you go east from the west to the east, back towards the East Coast. People tend to be a little more community-based, kind of family-based. There's more social hierarchy. And then if you go even further back in history towards Europe and then to the Middle East and Asia and Africa, those hierarchies get even more rigid, right? They lock in people. You think of the value, if all your businesses, all your companies had to be built with only your family members that you trusted, how inefficient your businesses would be. You don't want to have to hire your crazy Uncle Harry to be part of your startup company if you can help it, right? You want the best in the world when you can get it. So what you find in places like Silicon Valley is a set of rules that evolved as a function of the frontier, but as a function of other aspects of the California economy as well, which are these. Break rules and dream, so the idea that you shouldn't be bound by precedent. 2, open doors and listen, be open to diversity, and actually try to understand what other people say, as opposed to just pretending. Rule 3, trust and be trusted. So most people wait to be trusted before they give trust. And what you find in the Valley is the opposite, which is people give trust until it's broken, right? And the reason is because it's more efficient that way. But this is which makes it very easy to get burned. But it just became part of the way that people did business, and it's lasted mostly to this day. 4, experiment and iterate together. That is, you don't know what's going to happen, but you can figure it out if the team is there. And if you get the right people, you'll figure a way out. You just have to be willing to kind of keep trying. Rule 5, seek fairness, not advantage. Now this is especially important in the capital business, because what we've kind of understood as business investing is, well, the first chance you get to squeeze someone, you do it. And what's interesting in the Valley is because of the tight social networks that evolved, people often learned this behavior, which was, well, you're in a repeat game. People are going to keep working with one another. So you just try to treat people pretty fairly. In fact, you want to incentivize entrepreneurs. You don't want to take everything from them. And you want to try to treat other investors fairly because you might need them next week for something else. And so this idea of fairness and not advantage is profound and differs from what we normally conceive of as kind of a cruel Darwinian business model. It actually is deeply enmeshed into the culture of the Valley. Number 6, err, fail, and persist. So you can make mistakes and it's just fine. You just keep on trying. And this often ties very closely into the models of risk aversion in society. So where you have places like here where you have lots of government subsidized research happening, the risk of failure seems much bigger, and people tend to be less willing to take these types of risks because the cliff looks much steeper because it's so nice not jumping off that cliff. And rule 7, pay it forward, which is this idea that you help people in the system because you just do, and you expect it comes back around later to you. Most life we think of, well, quid pro quo. I help you, you help me, right? That's how much business works the way we think of it. But if you think of the Valley, it's this pay it forward model, which is you pay into the system and the system rewards you. And what that means, it almost becomes, trust becomes like a free-flowing currency, right? You can actually pay it here, and it doesn't matter where it comes from. It can come from anywhere. Just like when you buy an orange from someone, it doesn't matter, later on that dollar bill is going to float back to you, perhaps, so it's something that you make that they're buying from you. So it's like currency. So how do humans change behavior? Well, this is a model that comes out of cognitive behavioral psychology, which is this idea that people learn behavior just by doing it. By doing it and being aware of what they're doing. There's really no fundamental replacement for real live action. And so conferences like this are good to catalyze action, but they always have to be followed up by people doing stuff together and focusing on projects and goals that they can accomplish. And so what we find is that if you take the work of psychologists and you try to apply it towards changing economic systems, you get this, which is you get several tools you can use. You learn by doing, you enhance diversity, you celebrate role models and peer interaction. Because what we know is that people learn behavior through modeling. That's what all the evidence shows, all the neuroscience imaging shows, all the studies, empirical studies show. We learn behavior by saying, I like what that person does, and I'm going to try to copy that in some way and apply it to my situation. We build tribes of trust. So you think of the power of societies, of organizations. You think of alumni networks from universities. You think of guilds. You think of professional associations, right? The fact that someone's in the same grouping with you, there's an upward tick in the amount you trust them, that you're willing to work with them. So the ability to build communities. Silicon Valley does this accidentally because people feel like they've kind of bought into this tribe. Like, all right, I'm in this game for the long term. I'm not in it just for this transaction. And create social feedback loops, which is the idea that you're in communities where people know how you behave, so it matters. You can't screw one person and hope to get away with it because people will know. And you make social contracts explicit. The Hippocratic Oath for doctors, thou shalt do no harm. it sticks with doctors, right? I mean, there's no law that says you can't violate your Hippocratic Oath, but they do stick with it. It becomes a social contract. And you see this in a lot of realms of human endeavor, which is you create a set of rules and contracts and people agree to it and they stick with it. And it helps to make it explicit, to say this is what we do. So what does it all mean? What does it mean practically? There's a bunch of old behaviors that people have used for thinking of traditional economic development. And you can think of the ancillaries and the opposites in many ways in this model. So instead of basic factors of production, we have several new things. We talk about cultural transformation. How do you change the way people behave in communities? Instead of just clusters, technoparks, and incubators, it's not about physical proximity per se, it's actually about human connectivity. How do people relate to one another? Instead of just local first before going global, which is the way they've done business, they've done startup companies for decades this way. Think about wherever the value chain goes. You're a piece of the world. You're a piece of the global value chain. Instead of just writing smaller checks for venture capital, the people managing the money and their human qualities matter, right? Because they're the ones interacting with everybody else in the system, in the community. So people, character, it all matters. Instead of just hiring by skills and resume, which is what usually you do, right? You think of the list, we want someone with 10 years of experience doing X. The personal qualities of people matters. And you can hire people based on their willingness to be part of this game, this process of building innovative companies. Instead of planning specific outcomes, you experiment, adapt, and iterate. And instead of just measuring output, you start to measure the environment. We're actually putting together an index, just what we call kind of a rainforest index to measure ecosystems. And what it's going to measure is environmental qualities, environmental metrics within these systems. What can we do today to build a rainforest? People want to know action. So here's some ideas. Try fast, learn quickly, fail small, right? And then evolve. So this is sort of a basic premise. Build the roots before the branches. Instead of just trying to copy, people go to Silicon Valley and say, we want that, right? Think back to where Silicon Valley was 50, 60 years ago and build those basic root structures because the rest of the tree will build on top of that. What are the basics of a knowledge economy? Well, I won't go through all these in detail, but it's a lot of the stuff that relates to breaking down these barriers between various parts of the ecosystem. It's how do you combine top-down policies with the nature of bottom-up serendipitous innovation, and how do you let all those pieces interact in the maximum synergistic way possible. It involves capital, infrastructure. It's all the pieces of the ecosystem working together. One of the things we do is we'll provide these types of matrices, and anybody can do this, but it requires the ability to say, look, we have stakeholders. These are the pieces of the ecosystem on one side. On the other side, it's what are people contributing into that process? What do they give? What's their sweat equity? What's their actual equity? Or what are they paying into the system? And if you can get stakeholders around the table to actually map this out, you start to find, you start to know what people are giving and what they're not. It becomes easier to figure out what's missing. We also have this rainforest canvas, which is in the book, which is a way of what we call sequencing the genome. It allows you to actually understand the basic DNA of a community. And in order to create opportunities, you're looking for this intersection point between ideas, talent, and capital. The canvas allows you to do this. Before I get to the canvas on the next slide, this is the process, which is actually equivalent, very similar to design process that a bunch of artistic designers might use to create a new microphone or a new carafe. It's a process of thinking about ecosystems through an artistic design process where you're experimenting and adapting as opposed to sort of sitting in a room and kind of predicting, right? And this canvas becomes useful because it allows stakeholders to look at this and say, all right, what's happening and where are there gaps in the system? So you can look at the infrastructure, the culture, the role models, activities, what do people do, engagement, frameworks, resources, the leaders, and the stakeholders. And what you find is that every system's got tremendous strengths, and then every system has tremendous weaknesses. And if you can start to figure those out, then you can develop projects to actually hone in on the specific weaknesses and start to target them more effectively. This is what a canvas looks like if you kind of do a full-out session, right? You can actually imagine a room of people from different parts of the community kind of adding their thoughts and ideas to this canvas process. This is how designers do this stuff as well, right? They whiteboard it with sticky notes. And it becomes very interactive, right? People go up and they can actually play with this themselves. This is a conference. Mark and Lisa were at this conference we had a couple months ago on cultivating innovation ecosystems. It was something we built in partnership with institutions like the World Bank, the African Development Bank, USAID, the Lemelson Foundation. The idea is to create a conference to actually bring these ideas and make these models real, and to turn this conference ultimately into a living design lab where people can work on building their ecosystem projects. We had 400 people from 49 countries in the first year conference. And this is a program we just started called the Rainforest Architects, which is a professional development program for people in the business of building rainforest communities. So to close, the interesting thing about all this stuff about innovation ecosystems and rainforests, it's stuff that we kind of already know already. It's just that no one ever said it and said, here's the framework for it. Because it actually requires us to nurture what makes us uniquely human. In many ways, it's the stuff that makes us happy, right? It's the stuff that gives us joy. These companies that people build, it's not economic. You know, building really innovative businesses is a completely irrational, non-economic endeavor. It just doesn't make sense. It's too hard. People with that skill set usually can do lots of other stuff a lot easier. So it's the stuff that we enjoy. It's also the stuff that sort of frustrates us because we enjoy challenge. We want to try to break through it, and we want to get through the failures. So being comfortable with failure, being comfortable with sadness is really part of this process. People who've been entrepreneurs, who've kind of built these types of companies know, you're going to fail 1,000 times before you succeed. And then it's the stuff that makes us love one another, right? It's that rises above quid pro quo. Because if you think of our families, we don't engage in quid pro quo with our families, right? That would be a very bad family situation. You give into the system, you give into the family, and you just expect at some point it'll come around in a different way. And that's the way we start to think of these communities. If we start to think of the nature of innovative ecosystems as families, tribes, then we start to realize it's a different mindset for how you develop these communities and the programs within them. Ultimately, two people sitting in a coffee shop or a scientist and an entrepreneur trying to figure out how to build a business, it's how they interact, and it replicates across that whole system. One of the great ideas from leadership thinking is that everybody owns the problem, right? This is one of the great insights, which is if everybody acts like they own the problem, 100% responsibility, it changes the whole nature of the whole system. So hopefully this is a little bit of a flavor of stepping through the door to the rainforest for you. I certainly have been tremendously excited because New Mexico is such a place that is meaningful to me, but I also just see tremendous opportunity here. This is an amazing place with amazing people, with amazing ideas and amazing resources, and I'm very pleased to be able to be here and share a little bit of this thinking with you and look forward to many more good times to come. Thank you.